This episode is sponsored by Wix Studio.
When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
Hey guys, Future Matt here. I just wanted to give you guys some context. So right before we recorded the episode, and you'll hear it in the episode in a minute, the Supermaven and Cursor announcement was just made, and since it was only minutes before we actually started recording the episode, we had little more to go on than just the headline. So I'm just going to read you a bit of the Cursor announcement, which is on supermaven.com. So basically, as Supermaven matured, we realized that the next step for the product was not just smarter models, but models with new capabilities like jumps, co-designed with the user interface to access those capabilities. And that meant we needed to build our own editor because the extensions APIs in VS Code and JetBrains IDE were too restrictive to build the interface we wanted. Initially, we worked to build our own editor, but we were also in touch with the Cursor team. And as I came to know them better, I felt we could build a much more useful product together than Supermaven could build alone. And that's why Supermaven is joining Cursor. We'll continue to maintain the Supermaven plugins for VS Code, JetBrains, and NeoVim, and provide functionality improvements and better models when they're available. As part of Cursor, we'll have the ability to design the editor UI together with the models, and there will be improvements to Cursor tab incorporating long context technology from Supermaven. Thank you to everyone who has used and supported Supermaven. So now that that bit of context is given, you'll understand why we had no idea what was going on right as the show began, and let's get going right onto the show. That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All the Things podcast. This episode is titled, Does AI Have Tech Bias? Now, Mike, you wanted to kind of bring up something that every now and then you want to potentially kind of check in on AI with sort of a, kind of a subtitle to some episodes. That's going to be AI All the Things. So that's why you're seeing that in the title in your podcast app. Basically, if we have something to check in on with AI, we may use this subtitle. So that's going to be a little bit of a label for you listeners out there if you want to listen to an AI episode. So if this sounds interesting to you and you want to support the show, you can go check us out on that Patreon, leave a review or rating on your podcast app, join us in our Discord server, or share this with your friends. And Mike, you have done some digging into some AI stuff. And also, there was like a major thing that happened today as of recording, which is, I believe it's Supermaven was acquired by, what's the name of the company?
Cursor.
I always forget the name. So that's like a big piece of news that you brought up right as we were like just joined the meeting to kind of prep for recording. So why don't you, dive into the episode, and I assume we'll talk about the news maybe later on, or maybe mix it in.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to like off the top there, I don't know if acquired is the exact word they're using. They're saying like Supermaven is joining Cursor. Usually that means some sort of acquisition has happened. That's why acquired kind of makes sense here, but we don't have any details on how that merger or whatever is happening. So regardless, they're becoming one entity as far as I understand it, and Supermaven will be kind of working inside of Cursor.
There'll be way more news for the listener now. Like it'll be, the headline literally came out when we like jumped in our Zoom call. So, I mean,
yeah. Like that was live breaking news for us in the very second that I opened X while Matt was on screen. And I was like, damn, I have an episode literally with both of these technologies in it. And it's going to make for an interesting segment here because some things might change from what we're discussing. But overall, it actually doesn't impact too much on the episode side of things. Not a huge deal, but know that there is some sort of an acquisition going on over there or some sort of a merger, and that might change some things for both those products, honestly, moving forward. But again, Matt covered this, but I wanted to kind of reiterate, I wanted to do these like AI All the Things episodes for a few reasons. One is just to have a touch point where Matt and I can talk about different advancements in AI, especially when it comes to web development in general, stuff that impacts you directly as a listener, right? Like, because in my opinion, and the opinion has been evolving and changing, AI will be a significant part of every developer's workflow moving forward, to a point where there potentially might be a time when AI might change the workflow completely, right? Like, it might be that you're changing the programming language from a programming language to natural language, et cetera, et cetera. I'll talk a little bit about it at the very last segment, where we have a status check where Matt and I will like kind of give our opinions on what we think is exciting about AI, what kind of scares us about AI, and where we think AI will take our jobs. Like, will AI take our jobs in the next 10 years, for instance? We're going to do these status checks in every one of these episodes. I'm not going to say we're going to do these episodes on every month or anything like that. This is going to be essentially when an advancement happens, enough news happens in AI that it warrants another check-in with everything and another update for the audience on AI specific stuff. So with that covered, I kind of want to jump in. There's a couple topics that we're going to be talking about. The first one being AI autocomplete has evolved. So I'll get into that in a second, but that's essentially like those typical tools like Copilot. They have gotten to be slightly better, right? And there's different ways that they have become better, and I'll talk about that in a second. And the other part of this conversation is the title of this episode, AI has tech bias. And this one I'm actually really excited to talk about, because I think I have a unique perspective on it. I've tried different AI tools with different frameworks, and I've noticed a very distinct and very obvious trait of AI that I want to dive into. So stay tuned for that. That's going to be right after we talk about AI autocomplete has evolved. So tools like Copilot and TabNine were created, just a simple autocomplete tools. Like, essentially, you type in to your IDE editor, and it's supposed to, presumably, like from what you're typing or what you've typed before, it should give you a suggestion on what should come next, right? The TabNine version of this was kind of a rudimentary like lookup table more than anything like that. There was a lot of obviously sophisticated work there, but it was less AI and more just like traditional autocomplete. Whereas when Copilot came out, this became this AI natural language model interpolation of, hey, what could actually come after this that would help this user complete their job faster? And it was a much more robust solution that provided entire code blocks. It provided a lot more auto completion versus the tools before it. So it did have an evolution even before this stage, but still in that like Copilot stage, it was just still more of an autocomplete than anything else, right? And this worked well for companies trying to figure out how to expand. Like this worked well, but companies are still trying to be like, hey, we're at the forefront of this AI movement. We need to find out how to make this better. So how do you make autocomplete better? This is where tools like Cursor, one of the companies involved in this Supermaven Cursor merger, came up with. They came up with an IDE, right, which is like a VS Code, alternative essentially, that enables you to manipulate not just the next couple lines of code, but files in like entire file system of your application. So what you're allowed to do here is you can give a prompt, some sort of like regular word, like prompt with natural language, and have the Cursor IDE generate your entire file structure, or multiple files, or just one file, or two files. So it does much more than just auto-completing in a single file. It can go in, and if you're saying like, hey, can you please change this so all the files are using capital letters as their, like the first thing, like kebab case for all variables. It will go into every single one of your files and change every single variable to use kebab case. You can make it do project-wide adjustments, and you can make it do project-wide creation. This opens up a very big spectrum of how to use an AI tool that wasn't available before tools like Cursor came out. Now, Cursor isn't the only one that has this capability. Supermaven, for example, had this as well at a little bit of a lesser sense. And again, this is where it gets a little bit complicated because now they're one company. But regardless, Supermaven had this capability where it could go into multiple files and go into multiple sections of a single file. That was one of the first things they introduced that wasn't available in Copilot. But now it could go into multiple files as well. GitHub Spark was just announced by Microsoft, and GitHub Chat, Copilot Chat, has been upgraded to support this functionality, I should say. So you're able to talk to GitHub Chat. It's able to generate multiple files or go in and change multiple files. It's able to be aware of the context of multiple files, etc., etc. It's able to have this capability, right? So this is really cool. There's a ton of pros to it. I do want to have like a little bit of a pros and cons talk about it. But first of all, obviously for the pros, this allows for super rapid development. Like I said, if you need to, hey, I need this feature that touches three or four different files, boom, you can easily prompt it to do that. It'll create those 3 or 4 different files, and you have an entire feature built out for you. It has a high knowledge of your code base. So before Copilot, like initially Copilot didn't really have a very good idea of what your entire code base was like. It had an idea of what you've written before, and sometimes the file that you're writing in. So it had it could format stuff and similar to the files you have either writing in or you have open. And that was the extent of its context. Now the context has expanded to entire code base. So now it knows exactly where your utility library is. It knows where your backend APIs are. It knows, depending on what's in your code base, it might know everything if it's a monorepo. And it's much easier to chat with now to get directly contextual answers and suggestions based on your code base. So because it has that context aware window of the entire code base, if you have a problem, like if you have a bug that comes up, you can talk to it and be like, hey, I have this bug that comes up. And instead of being like, oh, do you have this file? Do you have this file? A lot of times Copilot would prod you to be like, what do you have installed? This knows exactly what your packages are. This knows exactly what files you are. So it'll give you much more accurate answers to your questions that involve an entire code base, right? So it's super powerful in many, many different ways. But having said that, there are some cons as well that I see on a pretty consistent basis that I think it's important to be aware of. It's much easier to make a mistake, or for an AI to make a mistake and you not notice it, right? Because it's generating not 10 lines, it's generating sometimes hundreds and hundreds of lines of code across multiple files. Reviewing what Copilot did, or what Cursor or Supermaven did, becomes a much bigger task. And so a lot of times you'll be leaning on the side of trust, and therefore if something goes wrong, you don't even know where it might have went wrong because you're not the one that wrote the code. You're the one that prompted for the code, the feature exists, but where it could have gone wrong is a whole other issue. You lose that awareness yourself of the context of your code because you're relying too much on the AI. I have personally lived through this, right? Like I've personally created a feature that has gone wrong, and I have had to spend extra time on top of what I would usually have to spend to figure out where it's going wrong and figure out the code that not I wrote, but like a Supermaven wrote, for instance.
Well, I actually have something to say about this, is that AI today in general suffers from, well, number one is it will try to do exactly what you say. So if your prompt, it's sort of like the meme of like the genie, right? Where you're sort of like, I wish for this, and like it's trying to like kind of side skirt your wish to get you. It's like, oh, well, you said you wanted to be rich, so now you're rich in how many eggs you have, something stupid like that, right? AI is a little bit like that, where you can say, hey man, make me an email form, and then you go, hey, this thing kind of looks a little insecure. So then you'll ask it, be like, is this email form secure? And it might reply with, no, that's a very insecure email form, because all it did for you was give you that email form. I had an example where I told it, I'm like, okay, I only want a maximum of 8 of these icons, these links to appear. And it's like, okay, yeah. And I start going through it and it's working, but I'm like, hang on, it's showing 10, but the way it's doing it, I actually don't mind it. But I was like, let me see if I can dig into this AI and like ask it. And it's like, yeah, it'll only ever show 1 extra one. And I'm like, well, hang on, it's not supposed to show 1 extra one at all. And it's actually showing 2 extra ones. And then I mentioned that to it. I'm like, hey man, like it's showing 2 extra ones. It's like, yeah, it shows 2 extra ones in these cases. So it's sort of like, I don't know if it's like lying to you or what you want to say, but it's based on the prompt, obviously. As I said, it might side skirt it a bit, but it will also do things like that. A really basic example, if you don't get what I mean just from saying it kind of on an audio show, is I had an example one time where I needed to brainstorm a list of like 5 just quick titles for something. So I tell him like, yo man, give me a list of 5 titles. It gave me a list of 8 or 10. And I tell it, I'm like, hey, that's not 5. And it goes, you're right. I made you a list of 8. It's like, oh, okay. So AI still has that weird, I guess you could call it passive aggressive if it was a human, passive aggressive, or sort of just like, yeah, man, this will do, like, almost like a salesman approach. This will do everything you've ever wanted. And it's like, yeah, but why doesn't this car start? Well, I didn't say it would start. I said it would do everything you wanted if it were to start. It's like, well, okay. So AI still has that bit. Now, I haven't used Supermaven or Cursor, to be clear. I mostly use like a ChatGPT to like get me started with like a coding project, or to ask it questions if I'm trying to learn about a new web API or something new to me, web API or something. And it will do things like this, where it will just give me side-skirted or sort of like weird off the cuff, as I've already described, sort of solutions.
It's never going to be 100% correct, or I shouldn't say never. At its current capability, it's not going to be 100% correct. A lot of times it will do some weird things. It'll make an error. It'll have an error. It'll do one thing correctly, but not do the other thing correctly. It'll assume too much. This one I particularly don't like, when it like extrapolates way above what you've asked it to do. So like, for instance, you ask it, hey, I need a button on the page, and that button should render like an image of some sorts based on how many times you press it. And you ask it a very clear like function, like that's what you need. And then it's like, well, then it's like, okay. And then it builds that. Plus it also changed the page to have a red background, and also created 17 different pages that have nothing to do with this button. And all of a sudden you have like way more code than you should have, that's doing things that are not in the realm of what you've asked it. And that bothers, like, this happens to me on a pretty consistent basis. And then I have to go in and either A, remove it myself manually, which I've gotten more like, that's the way I like to do it. But B, you can, prompt it again and be like, hey, can you remove that stuff? And then it'll remove that stuff and then add other stuff. Like, it's just, sometimes you can go down these rabbit holes of like, I'm using AI too much. And then you start to like pull back, right? Like, you start to like, okay, I need to not use AI for this. I need to not use AI for this. You need to use AI for this. Like, so you figure out where AI works for you and where AI doesn't. And I think the only way to do that is to like, first of all, know the code that you're writing and know how to code. The other thing is like, actually do it a bunch, right? Like just trying AI once and seeing like, oh, whoa, it did this for me. And that's how like 99% of AI functionality is represented to you on like X, for instance. There's like threads of, look at what AI can do. Those threads don't represent much of what's actually out there, because that's like cherry-picked results. Most of the time, if you're using it on a daily basis, you'll quickly pick up on its deficiencies, and you'll start to optimize around them to use what it's good at and not use it for what it's bad at.
I do want to say something actually with this is one way that I deal with, again, I don't use these autofill, I will use just sort of the chatbots, but one way that I identify whether or not I'm using too much AI on something is when I realize that I can probably jump in and fix it myself, or start pushing the code in a certain direction in a faster way or a more efficient way than constantly prompting to correct the AI to get it to code the exact way I wanted, right? So like if I ask the chatbot for a baseline of something, and then I go, oh, this would be really good if it ties into my classes specifically, or like how I have my classes set up, for example, because I'm often manipulating stuff with CSS. What'll happen is I'll keep like kind of like steering it, prompt. And then I realize like, you know what? I understand what it's writing. It would probably just be better for me to like take this, copy and paste the code that it gives me, do a proofread, and then while I'm proofreading, just fill my own classes in, and then add little bits and pieces here and there to kind of, instead of a prompt, I'm just coding. Like sometimes it just makes more sense for you to go in and do those things. And that's the number one prompt for me in my head, where I'm like, okay, I've talked to ChatGPT, I've talked to Copilot enough. It's time for me to get in there, get in the weeds, and just sort of fix this up myself.
Yep, that's exactly it. I don't know if that like makes it longer for us to code as well. Like, is it possible that AI is actually making it harder for us? Probably not. I think overall the time savings are probably better. But I do get into these situations where I'm like back and forthing with an AI, and I'm like, I probably could have just solved this myself without actually asking it.
Well, what sucks is when you engineer it in your head. So I've had a situation like this where I've lost time, where I have a situation in my head and I've engineered the whole thing, but I'm not entirely sure what web APIs I should use and things like that, right? And I'm like, okay, I'll get, ChatGPT to give me a baseline. And I'm like 2 or 3 prompts in, and I'm like, this thing, is not doing what I asked it to. Like, it's about 70% of the way there, but the 30% is not using my classes. Like, for some reason, it's adding IDs and stuff. Like, just use my classes. Like, I already have the UI set up. I have my IDs, I have my classes. And even if I tell it, it's like still trying to add things. It's like, let's add a tracker, let's add a custom attribute, let's add a custom property, let's do this, let's do that, all over the place. And I'm like, no, I don't need any of this. And in that particular case, this is when I was first starting to use these chatbots a lot, was I told it, I said, I would like to engineer it this way. and just in plain English, I think we could do it this way. Is it possible for you to do it this way? And he goes, oh yeah, you could do it that way. And then pumps it out and it's 5 or 6 lines rather than another 30. And I'm like, yeah, this is how I had it roughly in my head. Because no matter what, you always had to kind of tinker with the code. Most of the time you have to tinker with the code that it gives you. And I'm like, man, I could have just did that. I could have just took the 70% and then went and did the 30, right? And that's that conversation coming back to like, hey, you know, sometimes you're using a bit too much AI. But there are times like that where it's like, I just talk to a bot for like an extra 20 minutes or 15 minutes. And I could have just coded this in 15 and been done. Because now I still need to go in there and polish it and like test it and proofread it.
Yeah, I think overall, I probably have more time savings for sure. But these little tangential issues definitely do eat up my brain power in the sense of like, am I doing this correctly? I think prompt engineering is also a really, really important part of this, is like learning the right way to prompt engineer so that it actually gives you what you want. Has taken me a little bit of time to figure out. Like you said, like if you need to put it kind of in a box to get it to actually do what you need it to do, rather than allowing it to like hallucinate too much and allowing it to come up with different solutions. You need to be like, hey, you need to freaking do it this way. Not, you don't have to be angry at it, but like you need to give it more restraints and give it more information in the prompt and spend a little bit of extra time there rather than just, you know, splurting out your brain into a text box.
I mean, at the same time, this is very similar to searching for things, right? Like if we were to go back, I mean, I say go back, but we still have it obviously at the forefront is SEO, and searching for things on a search engine is still extremely popular. And yes, I know ChatGPT is a search, but we're not talking about that. I'm talking about, you know, going in and typing in things. I mean, effectively what we were doing is like, we were kind of prompt engineering, right? A little bit. We were prompting the search engine to search, right? You were doing what was often called search queries or keywords, right? And what would happen is, I mean, people who were bad at Google, like didn't use it very much, would have worse, and it would, you know, quote unquote, hallucinate. We didn't call it like that back then, but if you were like, yo, I want to book a tea time at my local golf club, people who are bad at it might just go like golf club tea time. They don't know to type in the name of like the club. And then if that club name is common across multiple countries, they don't know to type in where they're at, right? Like they don't know how to build their search query so that they get the results they want. This thing will hallucinate and be like, oh, you want a tea time in California? Meanwhile, you're in like Poland. It's like, whoa, hang on. Like, that's not what I want here. And so it's kind of the same thing, right? It's like, this is like the next generation of search, almost, really. Like AI kind of seems like that. I see that posted on X a bunch, especially with the ChatGPT sort of search tool now, where people are saying like, hey, I'm not really using Google for stuff anymore. I'm more or less just using ChatGPT, and I'm using, you know, maybe Copilot here and there. And I don't mean GitHub Copilot. I mean like Copilot, I don't know, chatbot, whatever they want to call it. This is like, you know, Gen 2 of search. This is how we search up information, which is ultimately what you were mostly doing on the search engines.
I think the way that people are using AI is evolving, right? And so that is changing how AI is even working as well. It's all kind of a crazy concept. This is why I want to talk about it. I think every time a few months go by, I realize something about AI that I didn't know before, and it changes the way I approach it and use it. And this is exactly a good segue into this next segment in this podcast episode. AI has tech bias. This is something I realized recently. As someone that's not a, you know, React maxi that, you know, lives and breathes React all the time, I've been using AI mostly on Svelte projects and SvelteKit projects, and for the most part, it's been fine. It's been pretty good at picking up my patterns, using Svelte patterns, and it's like I've had no real big issues with it until this new set of tools has arisen, which is a complete project generation tool. So similar to like how Cursor can create many, many different files for you. A lot of times with Cursor, you're going to have a project and then you create files on top of that project. What these new tools like bolt.new or V0 or GitHub Spark are able to do for you is create an entire project, right? Or an entire like component for you in a dev environment from a text prompt, right? And so these tools can take, you know, just like want to create a to-do list. Can you build it in X technology? So for instance, can you create this to-do list in SvelteKit? It should have a backend. It should have a database. Like these tools can have everything that a regular application can have, including the authentication part of it, including like, you know, a database, everything, including integrations, maybe with even third-party services. Now you might need to add some environment variables there, but it'll tell you that. Like it'll be like, hey, To integrate with GitHub, for instance, you need to add this OAuth ID or whatever. It'll tell you what you need to add to do the third-party integrations. So from a text prompt, you can get an entire full-stack application. And for instance, I created a little RSS reader that would take the HTML of things RSS feed and parse it to create a little podcast website for our podcast, that with the ability to search on the podcast, with the ability to play episodes, see the show notes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was kind of like my test. And I noticed there was some serious tech bias. Now, what do I mean by that? Tech bias, I tried to build it using SvelteKit. I told Bolt.new specifically, hey, can you build this podcast application that will take this RSS and build these pages using SvelteKit? And the first time I did it, it built me a site in Svelte, not SvelteKit. So it had no backend, it had no database, nothing, right? And I didn't prompt it enough. I told it SvelteKit, but I didn't prompt it enough as to why I would need a backend. So I was like, okay, that was my bad. I went back and I was like, okay, I need a backend because I want to store the RSS in the database. I want to store clicks and stuff like that, like events in a database. I want to have a database because that's what I wanted to test. I wanted to test the full stack side of things. And it tried to do it with SvelteKit. And what I realized is that it wasn't understanding the SvelteKit syntax, like how server functions work in SvelteKit, how the server file, like the plus server.ts file or JS file works in SvelteKit. It doesn't understand how SvelteKit does these backend routing application stuff. It would jam pack everything into an API folder, which technically kind of works, but it was pretty janky in this case. And it was barely working essentially. Like it would crash on every second click that I did. I didn't do a ton of diagnosis. I was like, this is weird. Not a big fan of it. Later on, I was helping out a friend build out an application, and I was doing the same thing, prompting it, building out in SvelteKit because I would have a better idea of how to debug. And I realized it just couldn't do it. It just couldn't understand the SvelteKit side of things. And I was like, you know what? What if I ask it to do it in Next.js? And my assumption is that like Next.js, like these tools are trained on open source projects. Next.js is the dominant open source project that people use. So maybe it will do that better. And boy, was I right. Like, holy shit. It built it exactly like I asked it to in Next.js, using Next.js in the proper way, almost start to finish, had the right database, had the right everything. It built like instantly and it worked. And so I did the same thing with my RSS reader app, same exact result. It was able to do a Next.js app much, much easier than a SvelteKit application, right? And again, hindsight makes a lot of sense. Again, way more code is being written for Next.js than SvelteKit. That balance is way off. So of course it's going to know the thing that is more popular and be able to build it better.
This is one of the theories that I've heard about AI where I forget how it was phrased, but I really liked it. It was something like we're bottoming out our own knowledge base. It's like the age of information's over. I know I've heard that a million times now. But what's interesting is, part of the age of information was obviously the creation of new information, new development methods, new, et cetera, et cetera. New creatures were found, right? Like information was found on Earth, discovered on Earth, or was known about in books. And then it was more or less sort of transcribed or written in some way in the information age, on the internet, in books, in everywhere, magazines, everything. So information is freaking everywhere, including new information. That's the thing that I'm kind of drilling down to. And AI arguably does not come up with new information. So like there's like this thought of like, have we bottomed out? Like are we at a point where someone comes up with, Mat.js for some sort of thing, and it's the competitor to SvelteKit, it's the competitor to Next.js. But let's say it's 5 years down the road and maybe web traffic's way down because everyone's using these chat bots. So no one's writing about Mat.js on websites. No one's writing about Mat.js anywhere. No one's really, kind of marketing it or whatever. So Mike goes on to, his ChatGPT, or he goes on to his Copilot, whatever he's using, and he goes and asks a question about Mat.js, and it doesn't know what to do. Similar to how he was saying where the Next.js versus the SvelteKit thing. Unfortunately, is Mat.js going to die then? Because we have to remember that even though something has merit or something has value or something is better, the market conditions change a lot of things, right? There's a reason why Copilot, meaning the consumer Copilot that Microsoft makes, there's a reason why it has undergone a lot of different changes because the market dictates things. If Copilot in its original form was selling like hotcakes and billions of people were buying it, Microsoft would just double down on what they were doing, right? Maybe with some different changes. I know marketing and teams like that will change things. But at the end of the day, pivot here, pivot there, change this, change that, because I believe at last check, don't quote me, I believe it was $27.99 Canadian for the consumer version of Copilot per month. I mean, that's a hard sell to somebody. Like, people complain about, Netflix going up a couple bucks a month. Now you're like, this is an all new segment. This isn't something that we're tacking on a few bucks. This is $27.99 Canadian a month, which may be different now. That's a difficult sell to somebody. That's a difficult sell to somebody who's like, man, like, I don't really use this Copilot thing. I don't really use these AI things too much, right? So my point is, the market shapes how the tools work. Merit in that has a piece in it, but not always. So in this hypothetical, the market may all be on these chatbots asking questions. Matt.js needs guides and needs influencers to talk about it. Those influencers don't do that anymore because everything's on the chatbots. Now we've just bottomed out our information. Now new information really isn't talked about much, and Matt.js dies. Like, that's possible. Devs, this one's for you. I've got 30 seconds to tell you about Wix Studio, the web platform for agencies and enterprises. So here are a few things you can do in 30 seconds or less on Studio. Integrate, extend, and write custom scripts in a VS Code-based IDE. Leverage zero setup dev, test, and production environments. Ship faster with an AI code assistant. And work with Wix headless APIs on any tech stack. Time's up, but the list keeps going. Step into Wix Studio and see for yourself. Link in the show description and in the show notes.
This is my worry. Like, this is what I was trying to get to exactly in this episode. And I think, like, would you recommend someone a framework? Like, this is a perfect example. Like, a lot of times we'll recommend SvelteKit to new developers if they want to learn how to program and learn and quickly build a new website in a framework, right? A lot of times I'll recommend Next.js if people are looking for a job real quickly, because Next.js is the dominant framework in the job market, okay? So I recommend based on a couple different things. Now, this is another consideration now into that recommendation is like, well, you're a new developer, right? So you're probably going to need quite a bit of help from Copilot or any of these tools. Can I recommend you SvelteKit anymore? Because now you have that huge disadvantage of not being able to query it correctly, get the perfect code out, because it's just not trained enough on it. And so it puts a barrier for, like, just like you're saying, Matt, it puts a barrier for Matt.js or whatever the heck framework comes out there tomorrow, because how can you recommend that framework when, old framework McGee has been around forever, has 1 million lines of code written every day, and is trained perfectly on these chatbots. Like every chatbot knows how to use it. So a new framework will have significant more trouble, like a lot more trouble to build itself up than it had before, because of the ease of use of these chatbots and the inability of them to adapt quickly to the changing environment. And it's not really a deterrent on the chatbot, because that's how the chatbot works, but it is an indicator for, like, bottoming out new knowledge, like bottoming out our new frameworks and bottoming and having innovations be stifled due to the fact that it can't be indexed quick enough by a chatbot to be relevant in a developer's toolbox. If the choice is going to be between being able to have an autocomplete that knows this tool and have an autocomplete that doesn't know this tool, like, most of the time people will choose the one that knows the tool. Like, it'll choose the autocomplete that can actually do the job, rather than you having to, like, go be like, oh, this one doesn't know the tool, so now I have to work around that and manually code this. Whether that's right or wrong is a different conversation, but that's the reality that we're heading to.
Now, I do want to, not devil's advocate, I want to kind of jump in with a question. So, like, I've talked briefly about the ChatGPT, sort of like the search mode, right? So I'm looking right at the ChatGPT Windows app right now. I'm a premium subscriber, whatever it is. I pay for ChatGPT, and I'm in the Windows app, and I'm in a conversation. I have the typical prompt, but then there is a button here that's a little globe, and if I hover over it, it says search the web. I click on that, and now that's toggled on, and I can quote unquote search the web, right? I can type in my query, and it does it. So a lot of people have been calling this the search engine, like the ChatGPT search engine. That's sort of the layman way to describe it. The question I have with this is, so Mike, like, in this particular instance, it's sort of like, does this search solve any of those problems? Because, so, like, hear me out here. So if I were to turn that off, it's going to be more based upon like and I don't fully understand this, but from how I understand it as a sort of like a person that just uses this tool, having not researched it, is that ChatGPT sort of has a knowledge base that it's been trained upon and whatever, right? But that's obviously limited to a certain thing. Like it takes a while for ChatGPT to like almost quote unquote recrawl things, relearn things, etc. But if I turn on this like search function, it may look up those articles about Matt.js in my previous example. It may look up the things about SvelteKit in that, but they have to first of all be there. But like, do you think that this sort of like potential search future, I guess you could say, do you think that this helps, solves, or affects what you're talking about at all? Like,
I don't think so, and this is the reason. I think the search, usually how it works is you search for you ask it to search for something. It'll take the top 5 articles, figure out some sort of summary between them, the differences, the similarities, and give you a summary, essentially. The reality is that to actually give good code auto-completions and good code output, 5 articles on the web isn't going to give you anything. What you need is thousands and thousands of lines of code of people using it in the exact same way that you're trying to use it to then come up with an algorithm that will create the same thing that you're trying to create. So it essentially takes pieces from all the different code bases, makes it conform into one single code base, but it needs those code bases. Like you need to have examples of every possible implementation for it to have good autocomplete, and a search will only search so much. Like it won't go through every freaking code base. It'd be impossible. It would cost too much money for the search to do that. It would only go through like, at best case scenario, even if it does go through a code base, which I don't think it does right now, but even if it did, it would go through like a few and give you a jank together example based on a few implementations. Now, whether the bots get better at extrapolating based on some like implementations, like for instance, my ideal world would be you upload the docs, right? And it was able to do everything based on docs, figure out how the implementations work. But with these more complex examples and more complex implementations, a lot of times the docs won't cover those things, and you'll have to go into the actual code of the library or the framework to figure out some of the edge casey stuff. So it needs to go through the code of the library and be able to understand what those things can be used for. Like, I think that we're asking too much, at least for today's LLMs, to be able to extrapolate it out in that sense. Most of what we're seeing in terms of autocomplete is being done not by reading source code, but by reading implementations that have already been done before from these open source projects that it's trained on, and then taking that and like adapting it to what you're doing. I want to be clear here. I'm not an expert in LLMs and how they're implemented, so I could be wrong on that. Like, I know people have said like, hey, let's upload docs and it gives better examples. I just haven't seen a good example of that. Like I've tried to be like, hey, here's the docs for SvelteKit for Svelte 5 specifically. Can you help me migrate this code from Svelte 4 to Svelte 5? And it wasn't able to do that, right? Like it wasn't able to take that logic between the docs and my code to be able to make that connection. So I don't have much hope for the search functionality specifically.
Well, there's one thing, like, as you were talking, this popped up in my head, and that is, like, with the search functionality, what's weird about it is it potentially, I want to say potentially here, I don't know if this is true, opens us up to bias again. Like, you're talking about tech bias. It opens us up to bias again, because right now, in the sort of real world, if you want to call it that, the search world of, like, Google and stuff, there's people that will growth hack things. Now, I'm not saying growth hacking is bad. Obviously, Mike and I, need followers and stuff to be able to do what we're doing right now. So, like, sometimes we'll do a bit of some growth hack, things like everyone else does on social media. The thing is that the growth hack is not sort of like how social media, quote unquote, is supposed to be used, quote unquote. But social media is used in this way. SEO is used in this way. These growth hacks, right? Social media and then SEO is used in this way in order to grow quickly, and it's not in the official guide. So let me take all that word soup and bring it in. So what I mean is like a perfect example actually is Webflow. Really easy. If you don't care about no-code tools, that's fine. This is just an example. So Webflow, the official guides are like, hey, this is how you do this feature. This is how you use this feature. This is what a div is. This is how the link block is. It explains it. But the community has taken the tools that Webflow has come up with, and they've come up with their own systems of like, hey, I think there's one called Client First. Hey, you do it this way. Build scalable websites with components. Webflow, proper is more so advertising components as just reusable piece of code. Like it's literally like something like, hey, a content box might be a component because it's consistent across all your different throughout your site. Someone takes that and goes, I can make a super scalable website with this, with a few other features if I build them all together. So what's happening there is Webflow is providing us with the tool, and the community is dictating how that tool is used. It's the same way with social media. So social media largely is like, hey, come post pictures of your cat. And someone goes, hang on, I could post pictures of my app and get a sale on my app. So now the community is dictating, right? It's the community dictating that. So now the question is like at that point, like we're talking about tech bias, is like, okay, there's a little bit of bias on social media and on search stuff, right? SEO growth hacks, like I've already mentioned, social media growth hacks, a little bit of bias because we're kind of playing into that algorithm. And that's one of the main reasons why the algorithm is always changing, right? They're trying to like, hey, get out of here. Like we want to show these people's cat pictures. And the person's like, no, look at my app. So like drill this back down to AI with this new search kind of mantra, new feature. Well, what happens when people are like, I can get into ChatGPT. Let me get all my stuff into ChatGPT. Let me get my website into ChatGPT. And it just so happens that my website has all the Matt.js stuff you could ever want. Oh, now all of a sudden, ChatGPT is super versed in Matt.js. Let's keep flooding it. I did it once. I'll do it with a second site. I'll do it with a third site. I'll do it with a fifth site, 10th site. All of a sudden, Next.js doesn't look so hot. And neither does Svelte because Matt.js has a whole bunch of guides, right? This is a total, it'd be crazy to take the crown away from Next.js. It wouldn't be that easy. But you understand what I mean is like, are we opening ourselves up to that bias as well? Where there's been growth hacking, SEO growth hacking throughout this whole time. Are we at that point like where it's like, I could get on ChatGPT? Because I'll tell you this, I've written guides on how to do stuff in CSS, for example. I would love for them to show up in ChatGPT, and some of them certainly do, but some of them do not. And so me as a content creator, me as the writer of that guide might go, what do I need to change to get into that? At the end of the day, in my opinion, the utopia of something like a ChatGPT searching things is that it just kind of looks around and goes like, this is the most relevant and the most trustworthy bit of content for your question. Like, how do I get rid of the underline on a link? Right, with CSS. Simple enough query, someone's new to CSS, they don't know, so it pulls from my website. Maybe it pulls from Mike's website. But then it's like, someone else shows up and goes like, I want to start a CSS website and I got to beat Matt and Mike out, right? There's like that natural competitive nature. So the utopia of just like kind of choosing the best link becomes more of like an avoidance or leaning into people growth hacking. So is this where we're at with ChatGPT and these other AI tools? Are we going to start entering this sort of like growth hack era? Are we at the precipice of that now?
We are, and it's already started. There's already firms that do like, AI engine optimization like that. There's already tools, there's already things that can claim that they can put your stuff ahead of other products in ChatGPT. So like that's 100% not where we're going. It's 100% where we are already. And it's where, I don't know if where exactly this part will take, because the biggest problem isn't like putting stuff in front of it. It's dominating and having enough stuff to put in front of it. Because like it needs, again, to be able to provide good code completions, a documentation site isn't enough. You need 1,000 different examples that are able to show different implementations using the documentation, using your code, like Matt.js code. So like, whether that be a growth hack in itself where like, you have to create 1,000 different projects, example projects to feed it. I mean, at that point, you're already doing a ton of work anyway. So that's not really a hack. That's like you actually putting in the work to be able to make your engine understandable to these LLMs. I think at the end of the day, there needs to be like almost like a language that you can feed it. Maybe a documentation set you could feed it, or a spec sheet you could feed the LLM that would be enough for it to be able to create a good autocomplete set. So rather than just learning on a bunch of GitHub repos, you're learning on a very specific and created spec sheet for you. So therefore, any new library that comes out would just create this spec sheet for AI to ingest and be able to provide good autocomplete using that spec sheet. So I think there's ways around it. We might not have the technology now or something like that, or we might just not know what that spec sheet needs to look like. But I think that's hopefully where we go, where we don't bottom out. Instead, we just allow an easier way for people to submit their technology, their new libraries and frameworks, and have it be indexed properly and actually be able to be usable by these chatbots in the same way that it's usable with a million different lines of code that it reads. Yeah, I'm not sure which way is going to happen first.
Well, weirdly, if people are doing this growth hacking, it weirdly helps prevent the bottoming out, because the people at Matt.js in this hypothetical would be like, hey, I want to show up. And so they like really hit it hard, and then they hire influencers, and then they hit the SEO or the chat. Like, I don't know what you can call it. AI SEO, I guess.
I can't remember. There is a name for it. I was trying to Google it.
But like for the sake of like just talking right now, like the AI SEO, you're trying to get in there. So then at that point, because it's now a competitive marketplace, you would be like, I know that like my new framework, Matt.js, has merit. This merit is like, it loads faster. It's this, it's that, it's this, it's that, it's whatever. It's easier to code with. We want an install base. ChatGPT knows barely anything about us. We need someone to write a shite ton of guides, write a whole bunch of different, marketing articles and things like that. And then we're going to growth hack it, not just for Google and the traditional search engine, but also for the AI SEO angle as well.
Yeah, it's called GEO, Generative Engine Optimization.
I hate that, by the way. I'm glad you found it, but I don't like it's SEO and GEO. I just prefer AI SEO, mostly because I'm biased and just made it myself. I'm biased, that's it. Download Matt.js.
ChatGPT came up with, because I asked ChatGPT as well, did not find the right answer on this one, but it came up with CAIO, Chatbot Optimization.
Boo!
Boo. Terrible.
Okay, all right. GEO it is then. GEO.
Hated the ChatGPT one. GEO is better. But regardless, it is happening right now, and there's hopefully going to be a path forward where new libraries can be indexed really quickly and in a good way, so that AI tech bias isn't as big of a deal. Now, having said that, we've covered kind of the big topics in web development, AI. Obviously, this isn't like a new tech alert. Like, there's a million different AI frameworks or AI whatever libraries that come out on a daily basis. I don't like to follow that, because I think most of them are just kind of garbage and just, very surface level stuff. So this is more of like an industry trends conversation. But what I do want to do before we end this podcast is kind of have a status check, just like an AI check between Matt and I, and kind of discuss it a little bit here. But with what we've talked about today and what you know before, Matt, what do you think? Like, will AI replace our jobs in the upcoming year, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? What are your thoughts?
I wouldn't be surprised in 10 years, yes.
10 years, okay.
Now, I know that some people are going to, be like, oh, you're a doomsday, you're a doomsayer. I don't know if that's the right way to say it. But the thing is that, there are definitely problems that I've been stuck on, coding problems. And, as a, self-admitted, I'm not the best coder, because I kind of run around and run a business and then also run the podcast and do all this thing. So I'm kind of a jack of all trades, or I am a jack of all trades and a master of none. And I will sometimes get stuck. And get stuck to the point where I just don't even know where to start. And I will ask a chat bot, an AI bot, from start to finish, and then succeed at something that would have taken me much longer with just traditional search on Google. I'm able to succeed faster, better. And we're talking about this is in the first few years. I know there's some argument as to when it started, because there were AI art drawer, whatever. But at the end of the day here, look at smartphones. Smartphones were very, very early. We had Java ones, we had BlackBerry, we had Android, we had iOS eventually, and then a bunch of those kind of got shaved away. We had WebOS, they got shaved away, and now we have largely Android and iPhone, right? There's some other little ones always, but those are the big ones in the space. And even a titan like Microsoft couldn't make their mark with Windows Phone. So now the thing is, take a look at from 2013. Could you imagine using a smartphone from 2013, now, 2014, if we were to make it a clean decade, right? It's 2024 now. 10 years ago, 2014 would that smartphone you kind of be okay? Would you be okay with using that? Like, we've already become reliant largely on the tech that's in new smartphones right now, right? Like, I would not want to go back to having crappy camera and slow interface and not having, sites that aren't like a totally different subdomain for mobile, because I know that responsive was around then, but there was still a fair bit of mobile sites back then. And, go back a few years, prior to that, and it was even more, right? So this is a question, right? This is a question of how far 10 years to today, so like 2024 to 2034, how far do you think AI is going to go? We've already seen it advance rapidly with something like, what's it called, Sora, I believe, where it made the funny, Will Smith eating spaghetti video to something that, honestly, I would be totally fine using as B-roll in a video if I were to just have like a video where I talk over it and just needed some B-roll. Like, we're at that point, and that was 1 year. So, give it 10 years. Now, is it possible that this will plateau and I'm wrong? Of course. And I also mentioned in this episode that the market, people who are actually purchasing things and putting money to things, absolutely plays a role. Merit is not the only thing. Money is a huge thing. And so these things may very well be capable of taking over our jobs, but it's entirely possible that the market will say, screw you to the AI because it's too expensive or people don't like it morally, and it might go away. But then there's another angle too. Government regulation might come in and they go, we don't want to give all these people unemployment insurance, or we don't want all these people unemployed. If you employ an AI bot rather than a person, you get fined, or you get this, or you get that. You get all these, things that are no longer like you are not incentivized to use AI. You are punished for using AI by regulation. That's possible too. So I'm saying left kind of unkempt, left at full tilt in innovation. I would not be surprised in 10 years if development is a thing of the past. But that's a big friggin' if.
Yeah, I think it's a big if, but I kind of see it a little bit differently. I see it starting to shift earlier. So I see maybe 5 years, if we're at the right pace, at the same pace as we are now. I see in 5 years some of AI taking a significant portion of the current development jobs. But what I see happening is that will open up more opportunities for new companies to be created, for more competition to happen in the market, and for the requirement of maybe even more devs to support that new competition than before the AI boom, let's say. So I think the current jobs might be taken, but there might be new jobs opened up on top of these more complex systems that are built by AI to maintain the AI, to interface with the AI, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not thinking about it from a doomer perspective. I'm actually thinking about it from a more optimistic perspective, but from the sense of like what we're doing today exactly in our jobs, like writing the code that we're writing today, I see that transition starting earlier at 5 years. And with 10 years being the mark where like it is very significantly impacted the current landscape of how development jobs are working. So I see it, again, I'm trying to look at it from a more optimistic angle as maybe an opportunity to create more jobs, because of the fact that it provides a small rinky-dink operation to operate at the levels of a Google, maybe. You know what I mean? Like having that ability to maybe lower, like take down the tech giants a little bit and segment that market, instead of having these massive corporations have multiple smaller ones that are all competing for our attention. That is where I'm hoping it goes. And that's what I choose to believe, regardless of the outcome. But like, that's what I'm hoping for.
Well, I would like to actually like say something in your favor. I just looked this up. This is just from ChatGPT. I want to be clear, really brief. But there's like that that common sort of thing, comment that's always brought up by economists and people that talk about it, where they go, back in the early 1900s, everyone was a farmer or like involved in agriculture in some way. And there were less people then than there are now. And a bunch of people now have jobs. It's not like 90% of people today in 2024 are unemployed. So I asked ChatGPT about this, and it said, this is the percentage of people that were employed in agriculture in 1930 through 2000 in various milestones. So in 1930, it was 21.5% of the labor force. In 1900, so we go back, just to be a comparison, it was 41. So 41, 30 years later, and this is all approximately, of course, but 41, 30 years later, it's 21.5. 15 years later, so 1945, it's 16. Less than 30 years later, so 25 years later, we have 1970 comes around and it's 4%. We've dropped a digit. 2000 rolls around, so 30 more years, 1.9%. And it's estimated that in 2022, it's dropped even more by 0.3 points. So it's at 1.6% of total U.S. employment. So actually, I should actually say that. This is the U.S. workforce, I want to say. This is the U.S. workforce for all these numbers that I just mentioned. So like this is something really important to Mike's point, is that new employment opportunities do open. Like as one door closes, another door opens. The fear with AI is, which the jury's still out here, but what the fear with AI is that AI is opening and closing all the doors, where it's coming in and being like, I'm the artist, I'm the writer, I'm the social media manager, I'm the developer, I'm the person that deploys stuff, I'm the maintainer, I'm the mechanic, you know, because AI is coupled with robotics. And then it's like, I'm the manufacturing. That's the fear. So to Mike's credit, like, yeah, 100%. Like, you know, there's by like as agriculture shrunk and the amount of people went up. So people are still growing stuff. You need to feed all these people. But as the population increased over the years, the employment in agriculture went down, but people were still employed in other opportunities. Like who had an office job way back then, right? Like probably not many. But it's just a question of like, is this mighty AI all powerful? Who knows?
Yeah, that's the thing. I'm betting on the fact that it will not be all powerful and will still require human intervention to some degree, and that will just generate more work for humans. Just from looking at the code that it writes, like it writes great code and then it just puts in a random shit that can break and like that. I don't know if it's ever going to not do that. It might self-heal. That's another thing, is like it might self-realize those mistakes, but it could self-realize those mistakes in a hallucination and go down the wrong path. I don't know. I think, optimistically speaking, I think it's heading in a cool direction. I do think it's going to impact our job market. I want to be very clear on that. I do have that. I do think personally, like from my own, like I think it's going to change it. I am choosing to believe that it's going to change it for the better. You know, take your own interpretations as it is. But yeah, that's about it. Like, I think that's a good status check on the future of AI. We'll probably come back to this type of episode format in the future and discuss, again, same, like different concepts that are happening in AI and check back in on if we think it's going to replace our jobs. Maybe we'll go on the other end and be like, oh, you know what? It's not evolving rapidly and we don't think it's going to replace it. So I'm curious the progression of these episodes, you know, a year or two down the line, how our views change.
And I do want to point out, you know, something as well is, I mean, there are many people that assume that we are in a transitionary period economically as well, which can really change this. Obviously, economics play largely into the job market. And so there are some people that believe that we've reached the oligarchy stage of democracy, right? Not to get all philosophical and like, you know, left or right leaning or anything. I'm not going to get into all that. But there are some people that believe like we are in this, like, you know, there's a large disparity between the rich and the poor and how big that gap is. And I am not an economist. I'm not going to be the one to read the news to you or anything like that, unless it pertains to tech for the most part. However, like that is a question, and how the governments deal with that, if that's even a situation that, you know, ends up coming to fruition, can affect this, because AI is affecting employment. At the end of the day, a business would love to hire somebody for $0. That's the truth. You know, do you like, I want more stuff to be built to sell to make money, but I would like to have that for free. That sounds freaking fantastic, right? But unfortunately, it's further reaching than that, where it's like, wait, if I don't hire people, then the people won't have money to buy the thing I made. So then we have the whole like supply and demand, and we got to raise the price, lower the price. Oh, now we're not making any, you know, now our profit margin isn't enough, and it becomes a mess, right? So everything is kind of intertwined. And so I just want to kind of point that it's entirely possible that governments around the world might be like, hey, you know, the heck with all this. We see governments attacking social media right now, especially for minors, where some governments are like, you're 16, you're not using, you know, Facebook, things like that. Whether that's good, bad, ugly, that I'll let you decide that. But this may happen to AI. It may happen due to this whole economic situation that we may or may not find ourselves in, whether we're in a weird transition or not. Again, that's up for the economists and the officials to decide. But it will affect AI, or it may affect AI, because AI affects employment. So just something I want to bring in there. It's a big old question mark, and I'm not getting into who's right and wrong and up, down, left, right, center. I'm not that person, because I mean, I'll probably say a bunch of nonsense and then someone's like, hey, that's all wrong. I'll be like, oh shoot, it is wrong. So I'm not going to say that. But that's kind of like my 2 cents on it. If AI affects the economy, it affects a lot of stuff. So we're going to have to, keep an eye out for that. But I think that's it, unless you have anything else to add.
No, I think that's it. I think we've covered AI for now.
Yeah, so we'll hopefully revisit this. Again, we're going to try to use the subtitle AI all the things for little updates like this, and maybe some other AI content as well. No solid sort of structure on that, but that's kind of generally what we're thinking. But if you would like to support episodes like this, that's HTML, or please do so at patreon.com/HTML all the things. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteller via swoonworthydesigns.com. Feel free to leave a... Wait, I always do this. Always do it. We'd also like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, contributing author on HTMLAllTheThings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught, the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or a review on the platform that you are listening to this on. And this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media. On Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.